Hello, welcome to Jazz Is
Jazz's
MasterClass series
at the National Jazz Museum at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem.
I am Sekou McMillan, the curator of special projects.
My name is Albert Marquez, Zack O'Farrell.
My name is Shirazette Titten.
And we are in conversation with the legendary Bertha Hope. Jazz could only have happened here in America.
The key to everything was the radio.
So this world is too dense. 15 minutes isn't enough to cover it all.
Are you ready? I am.
In the United States and a lot of North America, we think of our separations as being white versus black. Whereas throughout Latin America, but also in New Orleans, the mixtures are much more gradiated. So you have this much more alive. My name is Zack O'Farrell. This is the Jazz Is MasterClass series at the National Jazz Museum of Harlem. And I am going to be talking to you about the Latin jazz branch of the jazz history tree. The first part of the story I want to tell you is about two sister cities, New Orleans, of course, and the jewel of the Caribbean, Havana, Cuba. Now, a lot of jazz history will talk to you all about New Orleans, but as you'll come to learn over the course of this series, my soapbox is that these musics are actually much closer related than we think they are. They're much closer related than we give them credit for being, and they're much closer, more closely related than a lot of jazz history that you've already heard will tell you, right? So the first thing I'm going to start with is two facts. One is that there was a ferry that connected New Orleans and Havana multiple times a day for decades, from the late 19th century up through the early 20th century. The second fact is that New Orleans, sitting on the northern edge of the Gulf of Mexico, is not only considered by its citizens, but actually is the northernmost Caribbean city. Why does this matter? Because it tells us that New Orleans history has more to do with the history of similar cities throughout the Americas, like Havana, like Santo Domingo, like Cartagena, like even Veracruz, Mexico. It has more to do with cities like that than it has to do with most North American cities, because it has that same essential mixture of peoples, right? It has that same essential mixture of Europeans, enslaved and free, people of African descent, and an ever dwindling, unfortunately, indigenous population over the centuries. On top of that, another thing that people don't always tell you is that New Orleans, on top of that, New Orleans, we know of it as a French city. It actually was under Spanish rule for at least as long as it was under French rule. What does this mean? This means that it inherited a certain French mixture of peoples, a certain Spanish mixture of peoples, and inherited a certain Spanish almost caste system of colors, meaning that, in the United States and a lot of North America, we think of our separations as being white versus black, whereas throughout Latin America, but also in New Orleans, the mixtures are much more gradiated. So you have this much more alive mixture, this much more alive clash of cultures. So how does this relate to Havana and New Orleans musically? Basically, you have European music and African music not only coexisting but separate, but you have them meeting together. We talk a lot about Congo Square. Why do we have Congo Square? We have Congo Square because both the French and Spanish were Catholic, which meant that on Sunday, nobody was working. Even slaves had day off on Sundays to do what they were going to do, which meant get together, make music, and keep the drums alive. Now, what's different between New Orleans and Havana in this regard? In Cuba, sorry, we're gonna have to get into some unfortunate information here. Cuba was, Havana in particular, the main entry point for the Americas of slave ships from being brought from Africa. But more than that, the enslaved population in Cuba was constantly replenishing with new slaves. They would only, for a long time, they would almost entirely just bring male slaves. How is this different between Cuba and North America? In the United States, chattel slavery was practiced, which meant that after an initial enslaved population was brought in, it was more typical to it was more typical for enslaved people to produce offspring who were then a further enslaved generation, and this happened for ensuing generations. Then it was more typical to do that than to bring in new slaves from Africa. However, in Cuba, where the primary work of the enslaved peoples was the sugar harvest, which is a brutal task in the sun, in the heat, in the humidity, with sugar cane that gets sharp as you chop it. And there was a very morbidly high turnover of enslaved population. However, in Cuba, they would be bringing in new slaves from Africa. African cultures in Cuba stayed current with how African cultures were developing in Africa. Now, how does this translate musically? This means that in Cuba, certain musical traditions, certain religious traditions, certain social traditions stay more alive, stay more current, and stay more closely tied to concurrent traditions and religions and musics in Africa, which is why we have, for instance, bata drums in Cuba, which is why we have palo rhythms or in palo religion, which is why we have a vibrancy and diversity of African faith systems, African musical traditions, and African folkloric oral traditions in Cuba that we don't have in the United States. How does New Orleans figure into this? New Orleans was somewhere in between. There was a mixture of Catholic treatment towards enslaved people, meaning you had people who stayed together by ethnic group, who stayed together by in Africa they were called nations. Sometimes in our very anglicized history, we don't call them nations. We call them tribes, or we use slightly more derogatory terms. Maybe not slightly, but we can call them ethnic groups. We can call them nations. The Dahomey are a distinct nation from the Benin people, from the Igbo, from the Yoruba, right? That was maintained extremely alive in Cuba. Today, Cubans can trace their history, whether by familial ties or whether by familial ethnic ties or religious ties, to specific peoples from Africa. The different African faith-based systems in Cuba know exactly which ethnic group and which nation of people they come from in Africa, and how it's different from the other coexisting traditions in Cuba. In the United States, we don't have that. In New Orleans, we have some of that. We have plenty of the erasure of specific African cultures and ethnicities that is typical of the United States and British colonies in general. But we also have some of that specificity of African culture and ethnicity in New Orleans that gets blended with indigenous identity, that gets blended with sort of imposed American identity groups in New Orleans. And that's how we get rise to distinctively New Orleanian traditions, to distinctively Creole traditions of the big chiefs, the jazz funerals, I'm big disclaimer here. We got to do a whole other series talking to Big Chief Donald Harrison, talking to Atunde Adjoa, Christian Scott about this, because they are actually big chiefs in this tradition. But that New Orleans tradition with the big costumes is very intimately related with these and being able to trace your different houses, your different groups, is very intimately related and has a very deep shared history with these specific African ethnicities coexisting in Cuba and maintaining their ethnic differences. Now, music. This is setting the stage for some really fascinating music history. So New Orleans was kind of, a very important port, but in terms of high culture, kind of a backwater. Havana was the jewel of the Caribbean. Havana was the richest city in that part of the world. And so what happens is you have everyone coming between Spain and into the rest of the Americas, including New Orleans, passing through Havana. And so Havana becomes this big cultural epicenter. And it's a two-way street. You have musical stars from Havana occasionally going to New Orleans to perform. You have also, as history goes on and the United States becomes more prosperous after the Civil War and into the 20th century, you have all these musicians from Cuba relocating to New Orleans. If you read "Hear Me Talking to Ya" by Nat Hentoff and Nat, I just looked it up 10 minutes ago, and I can't remember what was the second one's name. "Hear Me Talking to Ya." You'll see a picture of it right here, probably, as I'm telling you about it. If you read some of in the earlier chapters of the book, when they're interviewing people who were in some of the big bands of New Orleans in the generation or two before Louis Armstrong, before Pops, they start listing who were their idols. They start listing who were some of the top cats in New Orleans when they were kids. You'll notice half those names are Spanish. Half those names are coming from Cuba or Mexico, which is partially where the brass band tradition, how some of those brass instruments got to New Orleans in the wake of the Mexican-American War. But at the same time, as you have musicians from Cuba going to New Orleans and influencing things, notice the similarities between ragtime piano and piano tumbaos in Cuban music. Notice the coexistence of the clave in both places. You also have the more successful musicians in New Orleans coming to Cuba for some of the premieres of their big works, like Scott Joplin, Louis Moreau Gottschalk, right? These composers are going to Havana to have the premieres of their bigger works, partially because there's symphony orchestras in Havanas, there's ballet companies, there's opera companies. So you have this incredibly vibrant back and forth between these two distinct cities, these two very unique cities in the world in the history of music, that is laying the seeds for the birth of both jazz and son, two musics that will blossom into this whole universe of sound and artistry that has come to define so much of who we are and why we're here today as musicians.